Hello, guys, and welcome to day 14 of our Star Biology review. We're almost there. Just hang in there and let's get through this. So, for day 14, we are covering ecosystems, ecology, the study of how different relationships in an ecosystem can be seen, what those relationships are like, and what happens when we disrupt those relationships. So, first off, remember what a food chain is. Food chains are showing us the various relationships that can exist in a food or in an ecosystem. What we are looking at is the movement of energy more than anything. So, for example, we look at this very first food chain on top. We have a grouse. We have grass that is eaten by a mouse, mouse that's eaten by a snake, and snake that's eaten by a hawk. We are looking how energy is transferred. The arrows represent energy movement. And don't forget that the very first organism in a food chain, for example, the grass, is the producer, followed by the primary consumer. We have the secondary and the tertiary, the third level. As we move through a food chain, for example, from grass all the way over to hawk, your energy amounts are going to drop. Now, whatever position you are in a food chain, that is what's going to be known as your trophic level. So your trophic level is basically where are you in a food chain? Are you the bottom, the producer? Are you the top, the tertiary or quaternary? Now, depending on how many food chains exist in an ecosystem, we can look at food webs. So a food web is all the various food chains that can exist. Now, notice in a food web, even though we have all these different arrows, the arrows all start off with the very bottom level here, which is the producer. So the producer is still the most important role in an ecosystem, in a food chain. From there, the arrows are moving from who is being consumed to who is consuming. Now, on page 19 of your journals, you have a missing food web, a little food web that looks a little empty. We see a couple of arrows showing us some energy movement, but there's a lot of blank spaces here. So what I want us to do right now is we're going to fill in those missing arrows. Notice that when we fill in these arrows, we have to pay attention to where the energy is going to be moving. So if I want to say that the seeds are eaten by a rabbit, I need to make sure that the arrow is going to be pointing from the seeds to the rabbit. That is a horrible arrow. There we go. So that arrow pointing to the rabbit says energy is moving from the seeds to the rabbit. Likewise, if I want to say that this mouse is being eaten by a snake, I want to make sure the arrow is pointing that way because the mouse will be giving its energy to the snake. So we're going to fill in 8 more arrows here. Now that we have the arrows put in, what I want us to do is we are going to color in or highlight, or you can even mark it. The producers in this food web are going to be marked with the color. Actually, let's change this up here. The color green is going to show all of the producers. Notice the producers have no arrows going into them, only out of them. We have the primary consumers, that is organisms with one arrow pointing into them. We have secondary consumers, which we'll do in orange. Secondary consumers mean that they must have an arrow pointing from a primary. Sorry, that is not one. Here's a secondary. And we can keep going up the list, and we're going to end off here with tertiary. Tertiary means that you can eat a secondary consumer. Notice our hawk up here at the top. That hawk is what we call the apex predator, basically the top of the food chain. Now, we should realize that some of these organisms can take multiple spots in a food web. For example, the bird is not only eating a producer, it's also eating a secondary consumer. So, depending on the food chain, might give a organism a different trophic level. All right, here we have a question, a star question. So a food web representing the Gulf Coast ecosystem is shown. So we see this food web. Based on the food web, which organism occupies multiple trophic levels? So they want to know which organism, maybe in one food web, might have a spot. Maybe in one food web, there could be a primary. And another one, they could be a tertiary. So they want to know which organism fills in that kind of role. So looking at this food web, you always want to start off with the producers. So here's our producer. Here's our producer. Notice they have no arrows pointing into them, so that makes them producers. And then you just want to follow it off from there. So here we're looking for the loggerhead sea turtle. So the loggerhead sea turtle is both a primary consumer because it eats the grass directly, but in this other food chain, it is a secondary consumer because it's getting energy from this pipefish. So it is both a primary and a secondary consumer. All right, now that we're done with food webs, let's go into relationships in an ecosystem. Now, we call these relationships symbiosis. So the first relationship that we're going to talk about is predation. When a predator eats a prey. Now, the thing about this relationship is that predators and prey are going to influence each other in both population and evolution. As predator numbers increase, we see prey numbers decrease. As prey numbers decrease, we're going to use different colors for this. Here's our predator. As prey numbers decrease, predator numbers decrease. As predator numbers decrease, prey numbers increase. So they influence each other. So go ahead, pause the video, fill in your page 20. For our example, we mentioned a predator-prey relationship. A fox hunts a rabbit. So keyword there is hunting, right? They're eating. The rabbit numbers drop, which makes the fox numbers drop. The rabbit numbers go back up after the fox numbers drop. All right, now let's talk about the other symbiotic relationships that can exist. So the ones that exist without someone eating somebody. This is what we call parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. In parasitism, this is where we have parasite takes advantage of a host. Parasite benefits while a host is harmed. Commensalism, One organism benefits, the other organism is unaffected. And mutualism. Two organisms benefit from each other. It's a good, healthy relationship. So, spores of the fungus Ustilago mitis land and grow on sweet corn. The fungus then infects the plant tissue, extracting nutrients from the plant cells. The relationship between sweet corn and Ustilago mitis may best be described as, look at some key words here. Words infect, extract. Extract means take. So this is an example of a parasitism relationship. Go ahead and fill in our notes here. Notice on parasitism, we mentioned this word obtains from, right? They obtained from something. That means a host is taking something from something else. Commensalism. The orchids grow on trees to reach sunlight, so they are benefiting the orchids benefit. The tree is not being stolen from, so it does not take water or food. So it's not hurting the tree. It's just using the tree to get a little bit more sunlight. Mutualism. Bees receive, plants use. They both benefit from this relationship. And the last relationship we're going to go over is called competition. This is where organisms in one single area are going to compete with each other. They're going to fight, argue, go head to head for resources. And those resources can be food, they could be shelter, they could be for mating and reproduction, they could be for just general space, like this is my territory, I'm going to fight you for the right to be in this area of land. It could also be with plants. A tall tree, for example, might be competing with the grass below it for access to sunlight. Speaking of sunlight, they compete for that idea of space, access to light. So go ahead and fill in your notes for that, page 20. So going back to our talks of trophic levels and energy movements, remind yourselves that energy does move throughout an ecosystem. We transfer between trophic levels, so between a producer to a primary consumer, a primary to a secondary. And we can see this in the form of pyramids. The pyramids are showing us that the largest part of the pyramid has the most amount of energy. And that's typically going to be the level 4 producers. And as you move up a food web, so as organisms might get bigger, they are going to receive less and less food and energy from the levels below them. So we called this, go ahead and write this on your notes here. We called this the rule of 10. The idea that only 10% of energy moves up a food chain. So the first level of our food chain is the producer level. They receive 100% of the energy. Think of this like a leaf. Moving up the food chain, we have primary consumers. These are going to be the herbivores. Think like things like insects, grasshoppers, cows, etc. Notice the amount of energy here. 100% of energy at the producer level, 10% of energy at the primary level. This means that once the grasshoppers ate the producers, ate the grass, they only got 10% of the energy that the grass started off with. Continuing the food chain, we have the secondary consumers. These are carnivores. Think of things like frogs. Frogs do not eat plants. They eat bugs that eat those plants. And the frogs are only going to get 1% of the starting energy from this ecosystem. So let's say, for example, the producers made 5,431 units of energy. So we'll just write energy. Then that means, according to the rule of 10, the next level here is only going to have 10% of that. So that means instead of 5,431, they're going to have 543.1. How do we get that? We put an imaginary decimal point and we just moved it over one spot. That's 10%. For the frogs, how much energy did they get? Again, we moved the decimal point over. 54.31 now. Next level, the tertiaries. These are carnivores still, like a snake. They get 0.1%. So we're going to move that decimal point over again, one more spot to the left. Now it's going to be 5.431. And that leaves our quaternary consumers, like the apex predators. So they will get 0.5431 units of energy. But it does not matter who you are in a food chain, what level, all organisms are eventually going to be taken back in by the decomposers, bacteria. Once you die, all your energy is going to go back to a decomposer. Okay, which of these models represents the amount of energy available to use at each level? So they just want to know which one is showing us the energy pyramid. In this case, we should realize that we are looking for answer choice D. The grass is the largest part. Here's our large pyramid. Grubs get smaller as you move up. Armadillos get smaller. Coyotes get smaller. The last thing we're going to touch on today is this word called biomagnification. So just as we said, energy gets smaller as you move up a food chain. Toxic chemicals and pollution actually go the opposite route. So if an energy pyramid was about getting bigger at the bottom and smaller at the top, then pollution is actually going to be smaller at the bottom with producers and bigger as you get to the top. Now, this is because organisms, like let's say this killer whale, eat a lot of organisms below them because they don't get as much energy from them. So plankton, primary consumers, they eat a little bit of these producers. They don't need that much. They're not that big. The secondary consumers will eat some plankton, not a whole lot of them, but way more than the plankton ate because they get less energy. They need a little bit more. The salmon eat even more of these herrings because they're not getting a lot of energy from the herrings. And the killer whales, the orcas, these guys are eating a large amount of fish. So either bigger fish or just many more of them, thus making the pollution build up much heavier. So in the past, an insecticide known as DDT was used. However, the use of DDT was made illegal in 1972 because it did not easily break down and it collected in the tissue of animals. The diagram shows the movement of DDT in the tissues of different organisms. So which phenomenon explains why the orcas have more DDT in their tissue than the zooplankton? So again, think of this like the reverse pyramid here. As we move up from producer to consumer, pollution builds up, and this buildup was called biomagnification. So on the top of your notes, page 20, go ahead and write in the term for biomagnification. Toxic chemicals build up as you move up a food chain. All right. If you notice, we did skip a section on page 19. That is okay. We are not going to cover it. You are now ready for your activity today. Bye, guys.